The call came through at 11:47 on a Wednesday morning, right in the middle of a meeting I hadn't been invited to, but was apparently the subject of. I know that because my manager's manager, actually had left his office door slightly ajar, and I could hear my name being used in a sentence that ended with the words, liability to the team. I was standing in the hallway with a stack of printed reports I'd been asked to deliver, and I froze. Not because I was eavesdropping, but because my feet stopped working the moment I heard my own name said that way. Flat, clinical, like something to be managed. His name was Fergus Calloway. He'd been at Whitmore Creative Group for 11 years, which in agency terms made him something close to ancient. He had the kind of confidence that comes not from ability, but from tenure, from outlasting everyone who might have challenged him. My direct manager, Renata Shields, sat across from him in that meeting, and from what I could gather in those 15 seconds before I made myself walk away, she was nodding along to everything he said. I'd been at Whitmore for just over 2 years by then. My name is Cara Donovan. I was 26, and I was the junior strategist on Fergus's content division. That title junior was doing a lot of heavy lifting in that office. It meant I handled the accounts nobody else wanted to touch, the clients who emailed at odd hours, the brands that were technically profitable but not prestigious enough to put on anyone's portfolio. It meant I stayed late without being asked. It meant I learned quickly not to send ideas upward without first checking whether Fergus was in a good mood. But none of that was what I want to tell you about. What I want to tell you about is what I'd spent the previous 14 months building, why it mattered, and exactly what happened the morning Fergus decided it should disappear. Let me back up a little. When I joined Whitmore Creative Group, the agency had a client roster that looked impressive on paper and was quietly disintegrating in practice. We had 41 active accounts. By the time I'd been there 3 months, I'd learned that 8 of those accounts were technically under review, which was internal language for considering leaving. The client services team was stretched too thin. The senior staff were focused on pitching new business, and the accounts that didn't have a dedicated senior contact were essentially floating, responding to emails, processing briefs, delivering work, sending invoices. Transactional, mechanical, nothing that resembled an actual relationship. I got assigned 4 of those floating accounts in my first month because nobody else wanted them. A small outdoor gear company called Ridgeback Equipment, a family-run chain of boutique pharmacies, a Christchurch-based architecture firm, and a food importer who'd been with the agency for 6 years but hadn't renewed his annual contract in the last 2. My job was to keep them from leaving, while the senior team found time to give them proper attention. That was the plan, anyway. The plan that nobody ever came back to follow through on. So I did what felt natural. I actually talked to them. Not in a corporate way. Not in the way where you send a quarterly check-in email with 3 agenda points and a PDF attachment. I mean genuinely talk to them. The owner of Ridgeback Equipment, a man named Stuart Hollings, mentioned during our first call that he'd been trying to get the agency to help him develop a campaign around his new tramping boot range for almost 5 months. He was tired. He'd been passed around to 3 different account managers, and each one had told him they'd look into it and then gone quiet. When I actually looked into it and came back to him 3 days later with a rough direction, he was so surprised he laughed. I was about to ring and cancel, he told me. I've got the email drafted. I just hadn't sent it yet. I asked him to hold off. Not in a desperate way. Just asked him to give me 30 days to show him what we could actually do. He gave me the 30 days. By the end of them, we'd produced a campaign concept he was genuinely excited about. He ended up approving a full production budget that was 3 times what his previous contract had specified. He also mentioned, almost as an aside, that his business partner ran a wholesaler who'd been looking for a new creative agency. He offered to make an introduction. That introduction turned into a new client worth $80,000 annually. I noted all of this in my client files, not because I was keeping score, but because I wanted to understand what was working. I started keeping detailed records, not just the standard project notes that went into our shared system, but my own running document, personal details clients had shared, follow-up items I'd promised, family events they'd mentioned, business challenges they were navigating that hadn't turned into briefs yet but might. Aroha Ngata, who ran the pharmacy group, had 3 locations across Wellington and was thinking about expanding. I knew her oldest daughter was in her final year of secondary school, and that Aroha was trying to plan the expansion timeline around school holidays so she could be present for important family moments. I never put that in the shared system because it felt too personal, but I put it in my own notes, and when I checked in with her, I asked about her daughter. I remembered her name. Aroha told me later that it was the first time in her professional life a service provider had remembered her daughter's name. She renewed her contract early. She also referred us to her accountant, who referred us to his client. 2 more accounts. I want to be clear about something. I was not the most talented person in that office. I wasn't the sharpest strategist or the most experienced account manager, but I was paying attention when other people weren't, and I was making people feel like they mattered, and those 2 things turned out to be worth more than I'd ever been taught to expect. By the end of my first year, my 4 floating accounts had not only stayed, they'd grown. The food importer, a quietly intense man named Peter Rawiri, had nearly doubled his monthly retainer after I helped him reposition his brand, following a supply chain issue that could have been a public relations disaster. Instead of losing the account, we'd come through something difficult together, and that kind of experience builds trust faster than any well-designed proposal. I had also, by that point, brought in 4 new clients through referrals from my existing ones. Fergus Calloway had not asked me how I was doing it. That, I would later understand, was the first warning sign. When someone is generating results that exceed expectations, and a senior person doesn't ask how, it usually means they either don't care or they don't want to know, because knowing might complicate something for them. In my case, I think it was both. Fergus ran the content division on a theory of standardization. He believed the agency's value came from its processes, from the systems and templates and frameworks that he'd developed over his 11 years. In his view, a client relationship was well managed if it was consistent. Same touchpoints, same communication cadence, same professional tone across all accounts. Personalized service, in his language, meant using the client's first name in the subject line of an email. He had a phrase he used often in team meetings. He called it repeatable excellence. The idea was that if you could replicate the same quality outcome every time, you didn't need to reinvent the wheel for each client. I understood what he meant, but I also understood something he didn't seem to, that clients don't want to feel like they're part of a repeatable process. They want to feel like they're the exception, like the person they're working with genuinely sees their specific situation and is responding to it, not running them through a workflow. I never said this directly to Fergus. I should have, maybe, but I was 26, and he was the head of my division, and in that particular power dynamic, having a theory that contradicted your manager's core professional philosophy was something you tended to hold quietly. So I held it quietly, and I kept doing what I was doing, and I kept documenting what was working. The documentation is where things eventually became a problem. Around 14 months into my time at Whitmore, Renata asked me to put together a presentation for an internal strategy day. The topic was client retention. Why were we keeping some accounts and losing others, and what patterns could we identify? She asked me to look back over the past year and map whatever I could find. I spent 3 weeks on it. It was honestly the work I was most proud of in my career to that point. I pulled the data from our shared systems. I cross-referenced it with my own notes. I built a picture of which accounts had grown, which had contracted, and which had left entirely. And then I mapped the common factors. The accounts that had grown were almost all ones where there had been a consistent, single point of contact who knew the client personally. Not just their business, needs, their context, their pressures, their pace of communication, what they celebrated and what worried them. The accounts that had shrunk or left were the ones that had been managed transactionally, clean and efficient, perfectly adequate, entirely forgettable. My presentation included quotes from client conversations, things people had actually said about why they'd stayed or why they'd considered leaving. I included Aroha's comment about her daughter's name. I included Stuart's note about the drafted cancellation email. I included a section on referral patterns that showed nearly a third of our current revenue pipeline had originated from a handful of accounts that I'd been managing specifically. It was 47 slides. It was thorough, and it was honest, and it was, I believed, exactly the kind of evidence-based internal advocacy that should inform how an agency evolves its approach. I sent it to Renata 2 days before the strategy day. She forwarded it to Fergus. I found this out when Fergus appeared at my desk the following morning and told me that the strategy day agenda had been adjusted. He'd be presenting a summary of client retention findings himself. He thought it would land better, coming from a senior voice. He said this with the specific neutrality of someone who has prepared the sentence in advance. I asked if my research would be included. He said he'd pull from it where relevant. It was not included. What Fergus presented was a 30-minute overview of his repeatable excellence framework and why it was working. He cited aggregate retention numbers without mentioning what was driving them. The referral data wasn't in the room. The client quotes weren't in the room. I sat in the back row with my 47 slides on a USB drive in my jacket pocket and watched him describe a strategy that was essentially the opposite of what the evidence showed. I should have said something then. I know that now. But I was still early in my career, still learning where the lines were, still trying to figure out how much advocacy for your own work was appropriate versus how much was career damaging. So I said nothing. And for the next 4 months, nothing dramatic happened. I kept working. My accounts kept growing. Fergus kept running the division the way he always had. I kept my own documentation updated and separate from the shared system, partly because I'd started to sense that anything I put in the shared system was potentially visible to people who might use it in ways I wouldn't choose. That instinct to maintain my own backup records would turn out to be one of the most important decisions I made. Not because I was strategic, just because something in the back of my mind had started to feel uneasy, and I've learned to listen when my instincts are trying to tell me something. The crisis, when it came, arrived quietly and then all at once. A new business development director joined the agency in late autumn. Her name was Blythe Ormond. She'd come from a larger Auckland firm, and she had a mandate from the ownership group to identify where the agency's revenue model was most and least efficient. Within 6 weeks, she'd produced an internal report. I never saw the full document, but the parts that filtered down to us through the usual channels of office whispered conversation suggested that it flagged personalized account management as a non-scalable cost center. The phrase, apparently, was Fergus's. He'd used it in his briefing with Blythe. Non-scalable cost center. That was me. That was the work I'd been doing. That was Aroha's daughter's name, and Stuart's tramping boots, and PETA's supply chain crisis, and 3 years of conversations that had translated into growth the agency couldn't fully explain because nobody in leadership had bothered to understand where it was coming from. Fergus called a division meeting on a Monday in early winter. He stood at the front of the room with the calm certainty of a man who has already decided what's going to happen and is performing the consultation as a formality. He announced that the division was transitioning to a centralized account management model. All client communications would be templated and distributed through a shared inbox. Individual client notes outside the main system would be discontinued. The goal was consistency and scalability. He asked if there were questions. I raised my hand. I asked about client relationships that had been built over time, specifically whether there was a transition plan for clients who were accustomed to working with a named contact. I said it carefully. I said it without accusation. I was genuinely asking. Fergus looked at me the way teachers look at students who are technically asking a valid question, but are understood to be doing something else. Client relationships belong to the agency, he said. Not to individuals. That's the whole point of the new model. The meeting ended. People filed out. I stayed at the table for a moment, looking at my notebook, and thought about Stuart's email that he'd nearly sent. About Aroha, about PETA, about what happens to trust when you remove the person it was built with and replace them with a shared inbox. Then I thought about my own documentation. 47 slides. 14 months of client notes. 3 years of relationship records that lived, partially, outside the shared system where Fergus could access them. I went back to my desk and I backed everything up. Twice. Once to an external drive, once to my personal cloud storage, not because I was planning anything, just because, again, the back of my mind was trying to tell me something. 3 days later, Fergus called me into his office. He said the transition to centralized account management was accelerating. He'd been reviewing the files in the shared system, and he'd noticed that my account notes were less detailed than expected, that I'd apparently been maintaining separate documentation outside the main platform, which was a compliance issue. He was framing it as a compliance issue. I told him my external notes were personal working documents, not client data. He said anything related to client relationships was agency property, regardless of where it was stored. He asked me to share access to whatever additional files I'd been maintaining. I said I'd need to speak to someone in HR before sharing personal working documents. This was, I would later learn, the moment that changed his approach. The HR conversation happened the following morning. The HR manager, a careful woman named Josephine Parr, listened to my concern and told me she'd need to review the matter before advising either of us. She said it would take a few days. She recommended I not share the documents in the meantime, pending her review. I thanked her and went back to my desk. Fergus's response to the HR conversation arrived the following Monday morning. He gathered the division in the main meeting room under the pretext of a team update. Once everyone was seated, he pulled up our shared content management system on the screen. He navigated to the client folder. He found the subfolder with my name on it, the official one, the one in the shared system, not my personal backups. And then, while 16 people watched, he selected everything in it and deleted it. "This is what happens," he said. His voice measured and even when we allow individuals to operate outside team systems. This content was disorganized, redundant, and inconsistent with our new protocols. We're starting fresh. As of this week, all account communications go through the centralized inbox. He said my name once during this speech. He said it the way you'd reference a cautionary example, not with cruelty, just with a kind of breezy authority that made the cruelty feel bureaucratic. I sat very still. My colleague Priya, who sat beside me, put her hand briefly on the edge of the table in the space between us. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. What Fergus didn't know what he couldn't know was that the files he'd deleted were not the only copies. My personal backups were intact. The external drive was in my bag. The cloud storage was accessible from my phone. The 47 slides were safe. And more importantly, the actual relationships, the ones with Stuart and Aroha and Peta and everyone else, those didn't live in a shared drive. They lived in conversations, in memory, in the kind of trust that doesn't get wiped when someone clicks delete. My phone buzzed in my pocket during the meeting. I looked at it under the table. The message was from a number I didn't recognize, with a Wellington area code. It said, "Cara, this is Hemi Tamati from Pohutukawa Strategy Group. We've been hoping to connect with you. Would you have time for a conversation today?" I had heard of Pohutukawa Strategy Group. Most people in the industry had. They'd launched 18 months earlier, founded by 3 former directors from a larger consultancy, and they'd been quietly building a reputation for doing exactly what I believed in: personalized, relationship-first client strategy. They were smaller than Whitmore. They were growing faster. I texted back, "Yes. When works for you?" He replied within 2 minutes. "This afternoon, if you're free." I sat through the rest of Fergus's presentation with the phone in my pocket and my face neutral, and my mind already somewhere else entirely. The call with Hemi lasted 40 minutes. He was direct in the way that people are when they've already done their thinking and they're not performing the process for your benefit. He said Pohutukawa had been watching the growth patterns in Whitmore's mid-tier accounts over the past 2 years. He said they had a theory about what was driving it, and that theory pointed to someone who was doing something the rest of the agency hadn't noticed or had chosen to discount. He said they were in the process of building a client relations function, and they wanted someone to lead it. "We can offer you a senior account director title," he said. "Equity participation after 12 months. Salary, we can negotiate, but it'll be a meaningful step up from where you are." He mentioned a figure. It was, in fact, a meaningful step up. "We're not asking you to bring anything proprietary," he said. "We understand how that works, but we also understand that clients build relationships with people, not with agencies. If clients decide they want to work with someone they trust, that's their decision to make." I recognized the logic immediately. It was the same logic the data had shown me. The agency doesn't own the relationship. It just hosts it, temporarily, for as long as the relationship stays warm. I told him I needed 24 hours. I went home that evening and sat at my kitchen table for a long time. I thought about Fergus and his repeatable excellence. I thought about Blythe Ormond and her non-scalable cost center. I thought about what it meant to spend the next few years building relationships inside an institution that had just demonstrated, clearly and publicly, that it did not value them. Then I thought about Stuart, about Aroha, about PETA, about all the people I'd spent 2 years building real trust with. I called Hemi back the next morning and told him yes. I handed in my resignation to Renata that afternoon. She looked genuinely surprised, which told me that despite the meeting, despite the deleted files, despite the hallway conversation I'd half heard, she hadn't expected me to actually leave. She asked if there was anything that might change my mind. I told her I'd already accepted another offer. She said she'd pass it on to Fergus. Fergus sent me an email 40 minutes later. It was 2 paragraphs long. The first paragraph noted that my departure would require a transition period for client accounts. The second paragraph reminded me of my confidentiality obligations and stated that any solicitation of current agency clients would be considered a breach of contract. I forwarded it to my personal email. Then I replied, politely, that I understood my obligations and would comply fully. What happened next? I want to be honest. I did not engineer. I didn't make a plan. I didn't send a single message to any Whitmore client telling them I was leaving. I updated my LinkedIn profile on my last day and left it at that. The first call came 4 days after I started at Pohutukawa. It was Stuart Hollings. "I saw your LinkedIn update," he said. "I've been trying to figure out what's happening over there. Nobody's returned my calls for a week." I got an email from a shared inbox with a template brief request form and no name on it. "I don't work with forms, Cara. I work with people." I told him about Pohutukawa. I told him what we were building. I told him I wasn't in a position to make him any promises about what might or might not be a fit, but that I was genuinely glad he'd reached out and I'd love to catch up. We caught up. By the end of the conversation, he said he'd be in touch with his team about reviewing his current agency arrangements. 3 days later, Aroha called. She'd received the template brief request form too. She'd also received, apparently, a follow-up call from someone at Whitmore who'd read from a script and hadn't known her daughter's name. "I'm not being precious about it," she said. "But 2 years of working together, and the first thing the new system does is send me a form with a ticket number on it. I don't think that's the right fit for us anymore." I asked how her daughter was getting on with the university applications. Aroha laughed, softly. "You remembered." I had remembered. I would always remember. That was the entire point. It wasn't a system. It wasn't a process. It wasn't a framework for scalable excellence. It was just paying attention to people, because people are worth paying attention to. By the end of my first month at Pohutukawa, 7 of my former Whitmore accounts had either moved across or initiated conversations about it, not because I'd solicited them, because they'd looked for the person they trusted and found her somewhere new. Hemi was careful about this. He checked with our legal advisor at each step to ensure we were operating within every boundary. The accounts came because clients chose to come. There were no violated confidentiality agreements, no solicitation, no misconduct, just the entirely natural consequence of what happens when an agency decides that relationships are non-scalable overhead. They scale. They just scale to wherever the relationship goes. Back at Whitmore, from what I heard through mutual contacts in the Wellington creative industry, the situation had become difficult quite quickly. 3 of the accounts that departed had been significant revenue contributors. Fergus had apparently tried to explain the departures as market attrition, normal client churn, unrelated to the centralized model. But Blythe Ormond's efficiency report had created a baseline, and when the numbers started moving in the wrong direction within weeks of the new system going live, the correlation was hard to argue with. Peter Rawiri, the food importer who'd been with Whitmore for 6 years, told me later that Fergus had called him personally to ask what had prompted the change. PETA had been candid. "I told him it wasn't about the work quality," PETA said. "The work was fine. It was always fine. But fine isn't why you stay with someone. You stay because you feel like they're actually on your side. And the moment Cara left, I stopped feeling that." He paused, and then he added something I've thought about many times since. "Fergus told me that was an emotional response rather than a business decision. So I told him that every single business decision I make is an emotional response, because I'm a person, and if he'd spent any time thinking about that, he might not be in the situation he's currently in. That, I think, is the whole thing. Right there. Business isn't the absence of emotion. Business is what happens between human beings who have hopes and pressures and memories and values. And the idea that you can strip all of that out in the name of efficiency and end up with something better is a fantasy that costs, eventually, everything it promised to save. I don't know exactly what happened to Fergus in the months after I left. I know that Whitmore went through a significant restructure. I know that Blythe Ormond left the agency 8 months after joining. I know that the centralized account management model was quietly discontinued and that the agency hired 2 new account managers with a job description that, based on what a former colleague sent me, read almost word for word like a description of what I'd been doing. I know that Fergus is still there, in some capacity. I don't know in what capacity. I find I don't think about it very much. What I think about is this. 18 months after joining Pohutukawa Strategy Group, I was made a director. We have 23 clients. Every single one of them has a named contact who knows their business inside out, who follows up on the things that matter, who remembers the names of the people and the plans and the anxieties that sit behind every brief. Our retention rate is above 90%. Our referral pipeline accounts for more than 40% of new business. None of that is magic. None of it is secret. It's just the natural result of treating people the way they deserve to be treated. I kept my backups, by the way. All of them. They sit on a hard drive in my home office, and occasionally I open them and read through the notes I made in those early years, and I'm grateful that some instinct told me to hold on to what I'd built, even when someone was trying to take it from me. Not because I needed them to prove anything to anyone, but because they're a record of relationships that were real, and real things are worth preserving. If there's anything I'd want someone to take from this, it's a few things that I wish someone had told me earlier in my career. The first is this. The work you do to make people feel seen and valued is never inefficient. It may be harder to quantify than a call-per-hour metric, but what it builds trust, loyalty, genuine goodwill is the most durable competitive advantage that exists. No template, no system, no scalable framework can replicate the feeling that someone genuinely cares about your success. And clients, like all human beings, can tell the difference. The second is, keep your own records, not to protect yourself in some adversarial sense, but because the things you observe and learn and build over time belong to your professional development regardless of where you're employed. Documentation is thinking. The discipline of writing down what you've noticed and what you've tried and what worked is how you understand your own capabilities. Don't let anyone tell you that your own intellectual development is their property. The third is harder to articulate, but I'll try. When someone who holds power over you demonstrates, clearly and publicly, that they don't value what you value, believe them. Not with bitterness, and not immediately, and not without careful thought about whether the situation might change. But believe the evidence in front of you. People who dismiss what you know to be true aren't likely to be converted by your patience. Sometimes the most professional thing you can do is take your skills and your knowledge and your relationships to somewhere that deserves them. Fergus thought he was deleting files. He was actually illustrating, for every person in that room, exactly what his values were. And once you've seen that clearly, you can make an informed decision. I made mine. And on balance, on every possible balance, it was the right one.